What is the greatest? Who cares? I'll do it myself. In history, Canadian soldier Leo Major and his friend Willie Arsenault were scouting a Dutch town called Zwolle that had been captured by Germans in World War II. On the scouting trip, the two had decided to liberate Zwolle together, but were spotted and Arsenault was ended. Major, enraged, ended two Germans while the rest fled. On the outskirts of the town, Major intercepted a vehicle, disarming the soldiers there. He told a French-speaking soldier that all the Canadian artillery would be firing on the town in the morning, and decidedly let the free to spread the rumor, even returning his weapon as a total alpha move. That night, Major decided to single-handedly liberate the town. Arming himself with many weapons, he made explosions and noises, making it sound like the entire Canadian army was there. Several times that night, Major went back and forth from Zwolle to the Canadian base, taking 8 to 10 German prisoners each time. At one point, Major located the Gestapo headquarters and raided it himself. He ended several SS officers and the rest fled. By morning, Major discovered that the Germans who had taken Zwolle had entirely retreated. I should also mention that Major was a sniper who had only one eye and remained in the military because he insisted he only needed one eye to aim his weapon, and that to him, he looked like a pirate. The Dutch town of Zwolle was liberated by a one-eyed sniper. He was also in the Normandy invasion on D-Day and single-handedly captured an armored German vehicle that contained communication equipment and codes. After he lost his eye, but before this incident, this guy single-handedly captured 100 German soldiers. He started with one, ended the soldier's friend, then used his prisoner to force their commanding officer to surrender. As he was leading a group of prisoners back to the Canadian front lines, SS spotted him and opened fire. Major gave no care and continued on his merry way, dropped the first group off, ordered a tank to go after the SS guys. Then after they got ended, he personally marched the rest of his nearly 100 prisoners back to camp. Why? He was frozen and wet when he saw the first two soldiers and wanted them to pay. A general tried to give the Distinguished Conduct Medal for this, and Major refused because said general was incompetent and in no position to be giving medals. Shortly after, he survived a landmine, and guys, this is still before Zwolle. As if his confidence weren't big enough already, after World War II, he returned to fight in the Korean War and received another Distinguished Conduct Medal. While the Canadian forces were trying to capture a hill the Chinese currently was defending, Major led 18 men as an elite sniper scout force to a hill in the middle of the Chinese forces and opened fire. His team were able to take the hill. A couple of hours later, 14,000 Chinese reinforcements returned to take back the hill. Major refused, found cover for his men, and was able to hold back the Chinese through the night. There was also a period where he was heavily injured. As he saw it, if he were to recover in hospital, he would have to be sent back home and be unable to continue to fight in the war, just chalked up to another casualty. Instead, Major broke out of the hospital at night, still injured, and found a local family who let him recover there. When he returned to the field, he should have been labeled as AWOL and removed from his duties. However, whoever was in charge reluctantly let Major fight again, as they needed any numbers they could get. All right, I'm raising my hand. I vote for Major for the toughest Canadian by a landslide. And how is this guy not the basis of like a Quentin Tarantino film? Story 2. Donald Knuth is one of the big names in computer science. Back in the 1960s, he set out to write the definitive texts on computer programming and analysis of algorithms. The first 3 volumes came out and he started the 4th in the early mid-1970s. He was unhappy with how the newer printing and editions were typeset, and so he took a summer to solve that problem. A decade later, the 4th volume still had not been completed, but as a consolation prize, we got TeX, later extended to the more commonly used LaTeX. Without question, the most comprehensive and powerful language for creating documents with heavy technical requirements. It's a strange mix of a markup language like HTML and a compiled language like C. It is completely free and has been for well over 30 years and is probably the most bug-free piece of software I've ever seen. Certainly for its size and scope, there's not much out there of comparable quality. There is literally no mathematics that cannot be properly typeset in text and LaTeX. Its default style is instantly recognizable to any working mathematician. It's used across nearly all STEM fields, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that only accept manuscripts written in LaTeX. It wasn't until the early 2000s that drafts of the 4th volume started to appear. Nobody has seemed to mind. Story 3. The giant Norse axeman who held the choke point at the bottom of Stamford Bridge. By the time the bulk of the English army had arrived, the Vikings on the west side were either ended or fleeing across the bridge. The English advance was then delayed by the need to pass through the choke point presented by the bridge itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has it that a giant Norse axeman, possibly armed with a Dane axe, blocked the narrow crossing and single-handedly held up the entire English army. The story is that this axeman put down up to 40 Englishmen and was only defeated when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust his spear through the planks in the bridge, mortally wounding the axeman. The whole story behind this period of English history is actually really interesting. Basically, one king, Edward the Confessor, passed away and there was no obvious successor. There were four options: Harold Godwinson, king's brother-in-law and powerful popular nobleman; Harold Hardrada, Norse king and distant cousin; a nephew whose name I can't remember, a child; or William the Duke of Normandy, claimed the throne was promised to him by the king. The Council of Lords sat down and decided that Harold Godwinson was the best choice and he was crowned basically immediately. This annoyed William and Harold. So William started getting an army together, and Harold basically had to call up everyone he could into military service to fend off the invasion. Harold made his best guess about when and where the Normans would invade, but obviously it's not that simple, and his army was sitting around at the ready on high alert for weeks and weeks. Finally, it hit the point that he couldn't keep the army together anymore, and they basically disbanded. The Vikings, led by Harold Hardrada, took this moment to invade England in the north. They sailed in, marched for a bit, and then set up camp. Harold Godwinson scrambled his army back together and marched, cavalry was not a thing in England at this time, 185 miles in 4 days to get to Stamford Bridge, where they discovered the Vikings chilling because there was no way that the English could arrive from the south for at least a week or two. Then the Battle of Stamford Bridge happened, the English won in a resounding victory, and Harold received news that William the had landed at Hastings. So he turned his army around and marched them back to the south. 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson faced William of Normandy at a little hill called Battle. William the became William the Conqueror, and the rest is history. Story 4. Herbert Hoover. His whole life is a cyclical story of, here's a problem, nobody can solve it, give me total control. He then takes total control, offends literally everyone involved, and fixes everything. You probably remember Herbert Hoover as a guy who bungled the Great Depression. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should remember him as a bold explorer looking for silver in the jungles of Burma, or as the heroic defender of Tientsin during the Boxer Rebellion, or as a dashing pirate philanthropist gallivanting around the world, saving millions of lives wherever he went, or as the temporary dictator of Europe, or as a geologist, or a bank tycoon, or author of the premier 1900s textbook on metallurgy. How did a backwards orphan son of a blacksmith dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Midwest grow up to be a captain of industry and a U.S. president? How did he become such a towering figure in the history of philanthropy that biography Kenneth White said the number of lives Hoover saved through his various humanitarian campaigns might exceed 100 million, a record of benevolence unlike anything in human history? To find out, I picked up White's Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. Herbert Hoover is the first student at Stanford, not just a member of the first graduating class, like literally the first student. He arrives at the dorms 2 months early to get a head start on various money-making schemes, including distributing newspapers, delivering laundry, tending livestock, and helping other students register. He would later sell some of these businesses to other students and start more, operating a constant churn of enterprises throughout his college career. His academics remain mediocre, and he continues to have few friends until he tries out for the football team in sophomore year. He has like zero athletic talent and fails miserably, but the coach, whose eye for talent apparently transcends athletics, spots potential in Hoover and asks him to come on as a team manager. In this role, Hoover is an unqualified success. He turns the team's debt into a surplus and starts the big game, a UC Berkeley versus Stanford football match played on Thanksgiving, which remains a beloved Stanford football tradition. Other Stanford students notice his competence, and by his senior year, he's running not just the football team, but the baseball team, a lecture series, a set of concerts and plays, and much of the student government. Herbert Hoover, if not for the Great Depression, would have been known as one of our great presidents. He did try to solve the Great Depression. He did not just do nothing like the myths would have it, but it just did not work out. He was actually considered in his day more progressive than folks like Harding and Coolidge, and did believe more in government intervention than those two. There's even a book by Richard Norton Smith called Hoover, America's Forgotten Progressive. And alright, if you're enjoying the video and learning a thing or two, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 5. Clarence B. Craft, Medal of Honor winner in World War II, his citation reads, "He was a rifleman when his platoon spearheaded an attack on Hen Hill, the tactical position on which the entire Nahashuri-Yanaburu line of Japanese defense on Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands was hinged. For 12 days, our forces had been stalled and repeated heavy attacks by one battalion, and then another had been thrown back by the enemy with serious casualties. With 5 comrades, Kraft was dispatched in advance of Company G to feel out the enemy resistance. The group had proceeded only a short distance up the slope when weapons fired, coupled with a horrific barrage of grenades, wounded 3 and pinned down the others. Against odds that appeared reckless, Kraft launched a remarkable one-man attack. He stood up in full view of the enemy and began firing with precise marksmanship wherever he saw a hostile movement. He steadily advanced up the hill, ending Japanese soldiers with rapid fire, driving others to cover in their strongly disposed trenches, unhesitatingly facing alone the strength that had previously beaten back attacks in battalion strength. He reached the crest of the hill, where he stood silhouetted against the sky while quickly throwing grenades at extremely short range into enemy positions. His extraordinary deed lifted the pressure from his company for the moment, allowing members of his platoon to comply with his motions to advance and pass him more grenades. With the chain of his comrades supplying him while he stood atop the hill, he furiously hurled a total of 2 cases of grenades into a main trench and other positions on the reverse slope of Hen Hill, meanwhile directing the aim of his fellow soldiers who threw grenades from the slope below him. He left his position, where grenades from both sides were passing over his head and bursting on either slope, to attack the main enemy trench as confusion and panic seized the defenders. Straddling the excavation, he pumped weapon fire into the Japanese at point-blank range, ending many and causing the others to flee down the trench. Pursuing them, he came upon a weapon which was still creating havoc in the American ranks. With weapons and a grenade, he wiped out this position. By this time, the Japanese were in complete rout and American forces were swarming over the hill. Kraft continued down the central trench to the mouth of a cave where many of the enemy had taken cover. A satchel charge was brought to him and he tossed it into the cave. It failed to explode. With great daring, the intrepid fighter retrieved the charge from the cave, relighted the fuse, and threw it back, sealing up the Japs in a tomb. In the local action, against tremendously superior forces heavily armed with weapons, Kraft ended at least 25 of the enemy, but his contribution to the campaign on Okinawa was of much more far-reaching consequence, for Hen Hill was the key to the entire defense line, which rapidly crumbled after his utterly fearless and heroic attack. And I'd like to think that a god of war sometimes takes the body of man during such desperate times and shows us mere mortals how war is done. Story 6. Everyone else has hit on the popular ones, the less popular ones, and the ones you will only find after your 3rd hour of a very focused Wikipedia spelunking. I'll share one with you can't find anywhere because he's not a notable figure in a grander history. He is my uncle, the roughest guy I've ever known. His moments of stubbornness, harsh individualism, and even creativity are talked about in the family as fun anecdotes. But growing up, they were a mythology to me. When we moved to a new state, my uncle let me and my mom stay with him for some time. He had a number of strange things going on. His dog connected the name to the feeling of flooring surfaces and could be told exactly where to stand. The unusual found art of a homesteader personality, trinkets, found pictures, and bits of glass. At this point in time, my uncle had 2 major burdens, a drinking problem and a mouthful of teeth. He would drink to ease the pain, and it would transform him into the biggest schmuck I ever knew. He wasn't mistreating, he just wouldn't shut up. Eventually, self-medicating with the drinks wasn't effective anymore, and he saw a dentist. It gotta be bad if you see in a professional, you know? He wanted all of his teeth pulled and dentures in their place. The dentist said my uncle still had a few healthy teeth, that dentures wouldn't be the best option for him. They offered to pull those beyond hope, but that would be all. He was too stubborn for that answer. His teeth, rotten, failing, or functional, had all betrayed him as far as he was concerned, and he was not going to be a man with a half set of teeth, if that. So that night, after I had gone to sleep, my uncle sat at the kitchen table armed with a bottle of drink and his Leatherman pliers. He drank himself numb. My mom was ready with the rags, iodine, and cotton balls. She expected screams, maybe an ambulance. Nope, she said my uncle made quick work of it, cried in relief, and slept soundly with a mouthful of paper towels. I saw the aftermath of a stained kitchen table, but that was all. He got his dentures, and I don't think it's any coincidence that he chose sobriety shortly after. Story 7. Admiral Yi Sun-shin of Korea. When the Japanese launched their first invasion of Korea, the Korean kingdom was not prepared. Hideyoshi's fleet just basically got free passage despite Korea's better navy at the time, because the guy in charge took one look at a bunch of transports that went all Leroy Jenkins and thought, oh no, scuttle our entire fleet, we have no chance. Enter Admiral Yi Sun-shin, who invented a new type of ship called the Turtle Dragon ship that had a spiked roof, tons of cannons, and it could spew fire. He took his one turtle ship and a bunch of refitted fishing boats and kept destroying the Japanese navy in battle after battle, despite being horribly outnumbered. Oh, and he did this without ever losing a single ship, not even once. By this time, the Korean kingdom was like, good on you, Admiral Yi. And he got a bunch more Turtle Dragon ships and proceeded to mess up the Japanese navy some more, which disrupted the army's supplies, which stalled the complete takeover of Korea. Now, there were some troublemakers in the king's court who really did not like Yi Sun-shin, despite the fact that he saved the Korean kingdom. So they made up some lies and got Yi Sun-shin charged with treason, and he was sentenced. Meanwhile, remember that fool who scuttled the entire fleet last time before Yi Sun-shin decided to take matters into his own hands? They put him in charge of the navy again. And do you know what he did when he saw the Japanese navy reinforcements? He ordered all the ships, even the turtle dragons, destroyed and ran for the hills again. So the king knows he messed up and halts the sentence of his one competent military leader. The king apologizes and says there's no way to win because now they have only 12 refitted fishing boats and no turtle dragon ships. Yi Sun-shin replies, hold up, we still have 12 ships. I'll lead them and mess up the Japanese navy again. And the crazy guy stuck to his word. He messed up the navy so badly that Hideyoshi's son, who took over when his dad passed away in the middle of the campaign, called off the invasion and told everyone to go home. But Yi Sun-shin wanted to go all John Wick on the Japanese. He wasn't about to let the Japanese go home so easily. So with some brand new ships and the aid of the Chinese Tang dynasty, he went after the invaders who attacked his beloved country. Unfortunately, the Tang admiral decided to go all Leroy Jenkins and charge the navy, which ruined Yi Sun-shin's strategy. Admiral Yi was all like, okay, everyone charge in, let's give our friends a helping hand. And during the final battle, Admiral Yi was ended by a stray musket projectile. As he lay fading, he told his son to wear his armor and pretend to be him until the battle was over. The Japanese navy was pulverized again and most of them never made it back home. And that is a true story of how one awesome admiral basically single-handedly saved his kingdom despite being messed over by them. Story 8. Joan of Arc's entire career was a giant, I'll do it myself. She had no military experience, she had no money, and she was only in her mid-teens. But her country was losing a war, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. She talked her way into a meeting with the king, talked her way into a sword and a suit of armor and a horse, and talked her way into permission to travel with a supply train. When she got to the siege, the guys who were actually running the siege treated her like a mascot, but she didn't let that stop her. She crashed war meetings where she wasn't invited and pretty much told everybody to go figure it out themselves. Then she went off to lead soldiers into battle, and strangely enough, the soldiers followed her. Even more strangely, they started capturing towers. Then she got harmed in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt. It was just about the same wound that had ended Richard the Lionheart 2 centuries earlier, but she didn't let that stop her. She pulled the bolt out with her own hands, which isn't exactly the smartest thing to do with wounds, but again, she didn't let that stop her. She grabbed a banner and rallied the next charge, which was a pretty good thing because that was about the time the enemy army decided to give up the siege. She could have rested up and gone home at that point. After all, she pretty much only had one usable arm at that point, but she didn't let that stop her. She started capturing more strongholds. After a particularly lopsided battle called the Battle of Patay, the enemy army was decimated, so she led her king on a march to get a proper coronation. But there were a lot of towns under enemy control along the way. This could pose a problem, but you know it already, she didn't let that stop her. That string of towns switched without a fight because, well, she had the whole army with her. Then there was no formal role for a peasant girl from the middle of nowhere at a royal coronation, but she didn't let that stop her. She stood beside the king holding her banner while he got crowned. Now, as an example of exactly what bad shape things were generally for France at that point, Paris was behind enemy lines. Once again, she didn't let that stop her. So she attacked Paris and once again got harmed, this time in the leg. She refused to leave the field and kept directing troops. At about this time, the political scene at the court started turning against her because she was getting far too powerful, far too fast, and she was chronically insubordinate. She didn't get the chance to lead the main army again, but she didn't let that stop her. She kept leading smaller forces, because this was the feudal era and troops were loyal to a particular lord, not like modern military structure. So there were noblemen who respected her accomplishments enough that they invited her to command the troops under them. How she figured out tactics so fast without any experience is kind of a mystery, but a lot of it seems to be that she was aggressive and pushed an advantage at a time when the norm had been demoralized and timid. They also said she had a knack for artillery placement, artillery being mostly crossbows and really primitive muzzle-loading proto-cannons. Without the main army, there wasn't a whole lot to work with, but she didn't let that stop her. After a few more small battles, she got captured. She did her level best to escape and nearly broke free because she didn't let that stop her. You probably heard about the rest, a kangaroo court trial where she sparred with her judges verbally every day. Several transcripts survive where she threatens her judges to fear for their souls. All of them learned churchmen, including a bishop, but she didn't let that stop her. And guess who's the only person from that courtroom who got made a saint? And if you liked any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.